The problem was not me, not dyslexia, not learning differently. The problem was the way that those learning differences were treated in an environment built for the myth that we should all be the same.
Hi, and welcome to School 2.0, conversations about education and everything else. Today's guest, Jonathan Mooney, is not normal, and that's a great thing. You see, Jonathan knows all too well what it's like to feel and to be told that you're not normal. Today, Jonathan is a successful author, speaker, entrepreneur, and activist for disability rights. But before that, he was a struggling kid in school, diagnosed with several learning disabilities, and told repeatedly that he wasn't normal, that he wouldn't be academic material. Not content to be a high school dropout, he worked his way into Brown University and got a degree in English literature. Now, I should stop here to say that Jonathan, as you'll see, really does not like the narrative that he overcame his disabilities. What he did was to learn to work with what he had to get the help that he needed. But not all people, of course, are lucky enough or have the wherewithal to do that. So at Brown, Jonathan met and befriended another student named David Cole, who himself was diagnosed with several learning disabilities. Together, they wrote a book called Learning Outside the Lines. It was a guide to college for people diagnosed with ADHD and other similar issues. It went on to do really well because it turns out it served a really large need. And since then, Jonathan has written another 2 books, the latest of which is called Normal Sucks, and that's the one we're going to talk about today. The book is written in a really personal style. It's an open letter to his 3 sons, who in various ways all asked him, "Dad, am I normal?" And based on his history and his writing and thinking about these issues, he has a lot to say about it. So today we're going to talk about how and why schools have been built around a fairly artificial, restrictive version of normalcy, whether Jonathan thinks that schools have meaningfully improved in this area over the past decades, and what teachers and schools can do now with kids in your classroom who don't fit the proverbial mold. Really excited about this conversation with Jonathan Mooney. Jonathan Mooney, how are you today?
All things considered, I'm doing well.
All things considered, that's right. We're talking in December of 2020, so this is COVID-19 season, and you're in Southern California, where you're getting the worst of it.
Yeah, I'm in beautiful Santa Monica, so we may be on a shelter-in-place ordinance, but at least the sun is shining.
Yeah. Well, I have to be honest with you, Jonathan. I'm super excited that you came on my show. I sent you an email a while ago, not figuring that you would respond. And you've been an author that I've admired for a while. So this is the first interview maybe where I'm just like legit nervous.
Well, if anybody out there trying to raise awareness about the tyranny of normality and the imperative for inclusion, I'm down with that mission. Well,
very cool. Thank you. And that brings us perfectly into the book we're going to talk about. And we're not only going to talk about this book, but this is kind of the springboard. It's a book you recently wrote called Normal Sucks. And I'll say that when I read it, I've read it twice now. It brought me to tears because it's a very long, extended letter to your sons about what normal means and why you think the idea of normality is kind of problematic. So I'd like to start by reading the first few lines of the book, and that'll get us into what this book is, why you chose to write it as a personal essay to your sons, etc. So here's the first 4 lines. Sons, you've each asked me a question in different ways at different times, and I think for different reasons. It's the same question I've always feared, but always knew you would ask me one day. So what is the question that they asked you, and why did that get you thinking about writing this extended answer to them?
Well, the question is, are you normal? Am I normal? And, it's a question that I think everybody at some point in their journey as a human being asks themselves. For some of us, myself included, that question is forced upon us by having experiences of being told that you're not normal, or that normality is something you should aspire to. But beyond those folks who, for specific reasons like mine, given my diagnoses with learning differences and learning disabilities, beyond that, it's a question that sort of looms over all of us. Michel Foucault wrote The judges of normality are ever present everywhere. And each of us are subject to their jurisprudence. It's a universal struggle to figure out where do we fit in the herd? Is the herd right? Are we wrong if we don't fit? And my children, like any child, ask me that question because it's one of the fundamental, foundational questions one needs to ask to live an authentic and successful life.
Yeah, it's amazing how early people will learn to kind of compare themselves to other people on different things. And I mean, schools especially, it's really, if the judges of normality are everywhere, they're certainly everywhere in schools. I have a 4-year-old and a 6-month-old at home right now. And, I kind of know all the problems with normality that you speak of in the book. And yet I still can't help but kind of judge, okay, is this kid doing what they should be doing at a certain age? Is there anything right with the idea of normality in that sense? Or is even things like, judging people by whether they're developing quote unquote normally by age? Do you think that's also problematic?
Well, I mean, I resonate deeply with that as the parent of 3, who have sat in those pediatrician meetings and had the growth charts presented and the
ASQ tests. Did you ever have to take those?
And to flush out the rest of Foucault's quote, the rest of his quote is, "We are in the society of the teacher judge, the doctor judge, the social worker judge." And those notions of sorting, monitoring, judging based on those charts is deeply embedded in multiple professions, institutional and academic knowledge sources. And as a result, gets embedded in us. So I don't in any way judge because I've done it, using that notion of normal as a benchmark or as a stand-in for okay, good, thriving, all the things that we aspire to for our children as parents, our students as teachers, and our clients as doctors. I think the challenge we come to is in the very notion of, what a norm is, which by definition is a statistical fiction. It's an aggregate, the average extrapolated to become the ideal. And those growth charts over time from 1900 to 2020 have changed. The norms on them have changed because of population changes. And so using it as a way to a shorthand for good, thriving, on the right path, I think is challenging. Now, are there places in which those charts give us information? Sure, of course they do. Are there deviations from the statistical myth of normality that they surface that we should be concerned about and that we should then subsequently care for? Yeah, I think so. But I think the word normal, because it's conflated, as Ian Hacking said, with good and right, is particularly dangerous. I think there's value in the concept of typical. I think there's value in averages and looking at distribution around averages. But that notion of normal, both as a fact in the world, but also as an ideal to aspire to, that's what makes it particularly dangerous.
Yeah, it's I guess the way I like to think of it is normal, like you said, is a property of a group, a population. It's an average of a population. And the mistake is often to take that and see it as something that's in an individual. A norm can't be in an individual because it's just an aggregate from that population. Like, I guess the way I explain it to my students is we could average all of your heights together and find out the normal height. And that normal height, because it's a statistical average, may not resemble any actual height in the room. It's entirely possible.
The normal number of children for a family to have is 2.5. I haven't seen point 0.5 kid rolling around out there, So that's exactly the danger in it, and in its embedded in its very complex, historical origin is the conflation of the average with the individual and the judgment of the normal as a thing to not just aspire to, but as a thing to be. And in saying all that, it's really important for me to reference the work of Leonard Davis, who's a disability scholar, theorist, literary critic, who wrote a profound book called Enforcing Normalcy, which really was, to my reading, one of the first sort of explications of that term and its dangerous use of applying averages to individuals opposed to large groups of data sets. And it's important to celebrate the work of Leonard Davis and others who I think were really the forerunners in this conversation around normal as a tool for oppression.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess it seems to me like your own backstory kind of primed you to think about these issues so that when your children asked you, am I normal? I'm sure there's a part of you that goes, oh boy. So let's get into your story a little bit, because it's fascinating, but it's instructive to people. One fact about you, for instance, is that you learned to read when you were 12, and that wasn't because no one tried to teach you. So let's go into kind of your backstory, and what does this say about the idea of normal and the shortcomings of that idea?
Well, the existential dread that was raised when my kids asked me, am I normal, came directly from the fact that I was told I was not normal. And I was told that in, very specific, in clinical ways. I was diagnosed with a constellation of language-based learning disabilities. We can take issue with that word later, but that was the word used at the time.
Yeah, let's asterisk that, because I do want to ask you about that word.
And then I was diagnosed a little bit later with a constellation of sort of behavioral / executive functioning disorders, ADHD being, top of the list. And I experienced special education throughout most of my K-8 education, at the very least, and then into high school. In a variety of different settings. And, I was pretty deeply wounded by the notion that my differences made me deficient. And then subsequently by a set of institutional practices that were designed to privilege certain brains and bodies over others. And then at the same time, designed to remediate the deviations from the middle of the statistical bell curve that I represented. The former, is really a form of institutionalized ableism, in which certain people are called smart, good, right, and other people aren't. And the latter is, a form of sort of social violence against folks who don't fit, to be made to fit, which is frankly what the word normed means when you turn it into an action. To norm something is to make it fit, make the square peg fit the round hole. And that in the day-to-day of education hurts people deeply. And so from that experience of personally living this, not in the abstract, not like reading Foucault in the corner, but like living it, emerged my 20 years of being a professional and advocating for folks with atypical brains and bodies in multiple mediums, and that experience is the heart of not just Normal Sucks, but really the heart of my kind of social mission on this earth.
Yeah. And I mean, what's really interesting, or what will be really interesting to a lot of listeners, not that it's completely important, but the fact is that you did very well intellectually after high school, right? You went to Brown University, you co-wrote one book, and then you wrote two others. So it's not that there wasn't stuff there in your head waiting to come out. I think in a video I saw of you, you said something like, teachers would ask me to write things down, my ideas down, and I couldn't write my ideas down. But that kind of led them to think I just didn't have ideas to write down. So, I mean, looking back on it, what are the things that, if you could go back and kind of tell your teachers certain things that they could use to help you flourish, what would those things be?
Well, look, nobody learns much chilling out with the janitor in the hallway. Like that's just not a good educational practice. I spent a lot of time with the janitor in the hallway, and that gentleman and those custodian professionals over the years played a big role in keeping me alive, because they were kind. And subsequently, I learned later in life, many of them grew up chilling out with the custodian in the hallway. I would say that our narrow notion of what constitutes intelligence is the problem, not deviations from that notion. I felt stupid. I'm not alone in that, because I had a brain that wasn't wired for reading. We know more than ever that the human brain was never wired for reading. In the arc of human evolution, it's a very new tool or skill set. Marianne Wolf's work is important and groundbreaking in a book called Proust and the Squid, about how the human brain was never designed to read. But nonetheless, we have elevated that skill as the pinnacle of human intelligence. The smart kid reads early, the smarter kid reads early and fast. And if you're not that kid, you find yourself chilling out with C Spot Run in the Sparrow reading group,
Which is the least fun book on the planet. So if you want to motivate them to read, probably is a good one anyway.
Dick and Jane at least has some sexual tension. It's a little bit more interesting. So I would say let's understand that intelligence is not one thing, but many things. Let's build school experiences, learning experiences that value the multifaceted nature of human excellence. Let's value the person who maybe struggles with reading, but instead can draw, talk, build, create, care for other human beings. Those were really the problem. The problem was not me, not dyslexia, not learning differently. The problem was the way that those learning differences were treated in an environment built for the myth that we should all be the same.
Yeah. When was it that you kind of figured out that idea? Because that's a hard idea that doesn't dawn on a lot of people, unfortunately. It's that maybe it's not me, right? They're saying it's me. There's something with me. But maybe it's just that I don't fit within this environment, and that's okay. So a lot of people who are diagnosed with various disabilities, told they're not good in school, don't really get to a point where they kind of suss that out. So how did you get to a point where you did?
You're asking the question, not as it pertains to my journey, but really as it pertains to everyone who has found themselves on the wrong side of normal, to their journey, and not a journey that's about going to Brown or whatever, but a journey of healing. A journey of feeling okay in the world, and having something to contribute. I don't blame my old self, and I certainly don't blame people living it right now who feel that they're the problem. And I think it's important for us to understand the relentless cultural channels in which that notion of your difference is the problem gets beamed into people's heads. Obviously on the school side, we know the practices, the pedagogical experiences, the systems that reinforce that, right? On the cultural side, the representation of folks with cognitive and physical differences in popular culture is reprehensible. If you want to signify somebody as a villain, give them a physical difference. We saw that even most recently with a new film that came out and rightfully was rebuked for its representation of folks who have atypical hands. And then on the professional side, there are entire edifices of knowledge out there that are about how if you deviate from the myth of normal, there's a problem with you. I mean, the most popular course on campuses often is abnormal psychology. I mean, the word says it all, right? So there's a tidal wave of ableist messages that gets beamed into folks' heads, and so I don't blame my old self, nor I blame people struggling with it. So the question is, how do you extricate yourself from that? It was really for me a lifelong journey up to this point. And I'm 43 years old, almost 44. There were seeds planted along the way, and listeners, I hope you can be those tend the garden this way and plant these seeds in the people you care about. One of the most important seeds was my mom. My mom was quite a character. She's like on a good day in high heels, she's like 4'11", on her tippy toes. She has a very high pitched voice, like Minnie Mouse, and she curses like a truck driver. And if you were a teacher doing wrong by her son, you did not want cursing Minnie Mouse in your office, But that's where she was every day. How did we know she was in that office? Well, we knew she was there because every dog in the neighborhood was running away, right? Like only bats could hear her high pitched obscenities. And my mom fought for me. She didn't fight just for my right for services. Services are about making the square peg fit the hole. My mom fought for something bigger. She fought for my right to learn differently. My mom would say to anyone who would listen, she would say, if my son doesn't learn the way he's taught, you should teach the way he learns. Now, I'll admit that's a paraphrase because when my mom said it, there were a whole bunch of F-bombs that I left out right there. Yeah, but that idea of it's not you, it's them. And it's not you who should change, but the environment around you, that was planted early. And if you are out there as a teacher, parent, whoever, plant that seed, plant that message, plant that idea in the people that you care about right now.
Yeah. In terms of talking about people sometimes just not fitting the environment, I remember this quote I heard from a stand-up comedian. It was from a TV show. I was just watching an interview. I wish I would have remembered it, the name of it and who the comedian was. But it was a comedian who was talking about them having, quote unquote, we'll get to the language in this, ADHD. And the interviewer was really prescient. And the interviewer said something like, well, how can you have ADHD and do an hour and a half set and remember the jokes and kind of remember where you're going and do all that? And the comedian, without skipping a beat, said, oh, it doesn't, I don't have problems then. It's only when I'm doing other stuff. It just illustrates to me that change of environment is often what helps, quote unquote, solve the problem that we thought where we thought the problem was with the individual.
Yeah, there's a great quote. First of all, how can you do an hour and a half comedy set without having ADHD? Good luck, normal comic. Ain't gonna happen for you, right? Like it's just not possible. There's a great quote by a guy named Russell Barkley, and I love this quote because Russell Barkley is one of the most staunch advocates that ADHD is a deficit. No ifs, ands, or buts. It is a problem in your brain, a problem in you. But even Russell Barkley and I quote, said, "There is no ADHD when a child is playing video games." Well,
Right.
okay, bro,
Right.
how can the deficit be cured by Nintendo? We can't have it both ways. And what he admits there is what you insightfully surface, which is it's not something people have. It's something people experience in environments not built for their difference. And that sounds like maybe like rhetorical shuffling of deck chairs. But when we say somebody has ADHD, we put the problem in them. When we say that somebody experiences ADHD, we put the problem in the interaction between person and context. And that's fundamentally where the problem lies. And that's not an insight that's exclusive to atypical brains. In fact, that notion of ability and subsequently disability being social constructs is a foundational notion of both the disability rights movement, but also the disability theorists that are advancing a more nuanced, non-medical based definition of what constitutes human embodiment. And that idea of it's not the person, but the way the person is treated that enables or disables is foundational for us advancing change because it reframes the problem. The problem's not the person. The problem is the environment. And that means we should be spending our energy as advocates, as professionals, not fixing the person, but fixing the context around the person.
Yeah. Well, so then we have two words to deal with. We have, we already touched on one, which is have. You have ADHD. I love the idea of you experience ADHD. I think that's way more accurate to your point. But then there's the notion of disability. It's a tricky word. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on the merits of either using the word disability or even the idea of diagnosing these learning disabilities in the first place. Because I've heard two different sides of the story, and I'm kind of sympathetic.
Yeah, I think we should parse those because I think that there are two streams that intersect and merge at some point, but it's important to put them into different buckets for a minute. So let's talk about this concept of disability as a whole. I claim membership in the disability rights movement. I claim disability. I am somebody who has been identified by public systems as having a disability. I have been disabled by the practices of those systems, and I have been devalued because of institutionalized ableism. In my case, the belief that a valuable person can read and a valuable person can sit still. And if you are not somebody who possesses those abilities, you are less than. So I claim membership in that political movement. I see use and utility in the concept of disability as a social phenomenon, not as a medical reality. I see the disability rights movement really owning that and advancing that social construct point of view. And that's what I claim politically, meaning when I think about moving forward in the world, advancing a North Star of a more perfect union and a more inclusive society, I use and advance those ideas. Not my ideas in any way. The ideas of folks who fought for the rights of people with atypical brains and bodies well before me. So I claim disability in that sense. Now, I don't claim disability as being a property of somebody's body or mind, but as being a social reality. Now, on the other side of the equation, other stream, the notion of diagnoses, because many of us come to a sense of community, a sense of pride, and a sense of political action as a result of diagnoses. That's where the identity of disability comes from. And it's one of the unique challenges of this particular identity politic, right? You're trying to claim something that by definition was mediated by a medical model. And so how do you extricate yourself from that medicalization of your difference? And that's a particularly nuanced challenge, both theoretically as we try to make sense of it, but also personally as you try to navigate it. So on the diagnosis side, I fundamentally believe that we should have information about ourselves. You know, I think that the notion of having a name for my reading challenges, it's not that I'm dumb. It's not, to your point that you said before, that people didn't do their job or try, or my parents didn't read to me. It's because of a neurobiologically based difference. That means I struggle with reading. That's okay to say. And that's important to say, beyond okay, because it gives us a different word. What I take issue with is, why do we have to pathologize that difference? We can very easily say that human beings have different capacities. As Martha Nussbaum said, there is no disabled child. There's children with multiple capacities, challenges, weaknesses, limitations. The reason we have to claim pathology is because that's the only way to get help in public systems. And I think that that is a very nefarious deal with the devil. Call yourself somebody with a problem, and that's the only way that you get individualized support. And in reality, we should be striving for a system that provides individualized support regardless of one's diagnosis. We should be honest that there's great equity concerns about the system of diagnosis as a way to facilitate support. And we should also be honest about the way that diagnosis has been used to justify the correction opposed to the empowerment of somebody with a difference, both in my life, in what may seem to be somewhat benign ways of remediating handwriting, remediating spelling, but in a more social, broad context, in the American eugenics movement that tried to exterminate or eliminate difference, because that's the logical conclusion when we decide to call different deficient, and not just deficient, but ultimately pathological. Well, guess what? We should just get rid of difference. So I think we need to navigate that and aspire to an experience that names people's biologically based limitations and challenges, and ultimately builds a world that accommodates opposed to eliminates those differences.
Yeah, I wonder if we're reaching a world that is actually much more, has the capacity to do that much more, especially that sort of individualization of things. I don't know if you're familiar with Sal Khan, the founder of Khan
absolutely.
Academy, but he wrote a book a while ago called One World Schoolhouse. And his argument, or one of his arguments in that book, I think is really deceptive. It's almost deceptively subversive. He's saying that the power of things like video instruction, computer-based instruction, is such that we might even be at a point where we no longer need to all be taught by the same teacher in the same room who has to teach the same way, because if you have 30 kids in the same room, well, you have to kind of treat them all in a similar way. You can't, as one person, very easily differentiate to that extreme for 30 kids. And it always struck me as a really deceptively radical point that I saw in that book. And I wonder if we're getting to a world where we can do that sort of individualization more, and where we can put more power in the hands of kids themselves to help determine, okay, this works for me, this doesn't work for me. Do you see any promising trends along those lines?
I think that we have the opportunity to bring that world to fruition. Like any opportunity, it's going to be about the choices that we make, which are ultimately a reflection of our core values. And I'll take the moment that we're in right now is a good example. Because of the disruption of education in the pandemic, we are at an inflection point or potential inflection point of acculturating ourselves to digital tools, of experimenting with alternative educational formats. And the question is, are we going to try to recreate the old school in new school tools, or are we willing to challenge the fundamental assumptions of school? And unfortunately, one of the things that I am discouraged by in my conversations with educators and students in particular, over the last 9 months, I had a conversation with a group of students, 70 of them, middle school, right before you and I started speaking, is how we've decided to just try to take the old school and jam it through a Zoom call. And again, a part of that is just people doing the best they can do. I understand that. But a part of that is also a set of unnamed assumptions about what education should be percolating in people's actions. Education, beginning in the 1900s, compulsory education was about making folks ready for the factory. I mean, that was the bottom line. It was about, turning out widgets, and it was designed. The education system was designed around the current notions at the time of average and normal. And we have yet to extricate ourselves from that sort of fundamental social purpose. So the tools are there. Sal Khan is right. We can personalize education for young folks, but that personalization needs to be to a different end. It can't just be to make the round peg fit the square hole. It has to be to proliferate the multitudes of shapes that we know are paradoxically typical. That has to be its goal. And that means that we need to challenge some deeply held assumptions about kids getting good at everything and maybe focus on them getting good at some things. We need to challenge some deeply held assumptions about what core competencies really lead to human thriving, different from success, right? Because success is a very pragmatic concept. Thriving is a very personal concept. And we need to be reverse engineering our practice with those answers in mind. And until we do that, until we really challenge some of those deeply held values, we're just going to keep doing the same thing, expecting different results. And as the saying goes, that's the definition of madness. And we are at that choice point, but it requires folks to make a choice driven by different fundamental values.
I mean, the power of the idea of normal is so strong. I remember reading your book, The Short Bus, when I was doing a graduate degree in special education, and I was teaching at the time under a conditional certificate. And I remember thinking, I sympathize with your points about wanting to really make sure that we allow kids to be different and we don't try to fit, square pegs into round holes. But at the same time, I also remember the pull of being as a teacher in a classroom, this doesn't seem practical to me because, I have so many kids. I have so much time. We have one uniform space. It's really hard to do that. So I recall the push and pull when I was reading that book just in my brain. It's a powerful one, especially for teachers who are in classrooms who have that limited time and limited space and stuff like that.
Well, and that's the shared common ground, and I'm optimistic about that. You asked me, are there trends and things that I've seen that I'm optimistic about? And one of the things I am optimistic about is a growing number of educators who say this ain't working. It ain't working for students for sure. But it's also not working for me. And this is not what I got in this business to do. And that may sound like the opposite of something to be optimistic about. But it is something to be optimistic about if we decide to realize that we're all on the same team on this, that this is not student interest versus teacher interest. This is our interest. And that becomes a coalition. And a coalition is when we build change. And I'm optimistic about the growing ability to build a coalition, not just because of teachers' dissatisfaction with what was happening, but also what was happening during COVID, but what's happening pre-COVID. I'm also optimistic because of the number of different student coalitions that are saying this doesn't work for me. We have gifted students dropping out of high school at greater rates than students with special education needs. We have suburban schools like Stanford High, like Palo Alto High School, where kids on the railroad tracks are taking their own life. It's not working. So the good news is we can build a coalition that tries to demand real change when we realize that we are all in the same place, where a system built on the idea that we all should be the same doesn't work anymore.
Yeah. So final question then, for those people listening who are motivated by what we're talking about and what they're hearing from you, what suggestions do you have? Again, kind of going back to if you have Jonathans in your class, and surely we do, what kinds of things should they do? Small things, big things, to make sure that students are able to flourish?
Couple very concrete things that we can do in whatever situation we find ourselves working with young people. One, commit yourself to building a positive identity in the young person that you are working with or care about. The number one thing I hear from young people, I heard it 40 minutes ago before we started chatting from young folks in the Antelope Valley here in Los Angeles. I hear that they think of themselves as stupid, crazy, lazy, defective, broken. They think of themselves as not different, but deficient. And remediating not the difference, but the deficit of self-concept is the first step towards change. And the path towards that change is about a positive identity when it comes to disability. A critique of disability as being inside of people, but being the outcome of a narrow environment. And ultimately, it's a critique of institutionalized and cultural ableism. We need to be saturating young folks with a message of empowerment and with images of positive disability experience in all of its forms. That's step number one. Step number two is to commit yourself to picking one thing that you can change, not in the person, but in the environment around the person. I know it can feel overwhelming as an individual teacher. You're not in control of the public policy. But you know what? You could put a bunch of clipboards in the back of your class when school resumes in person and empower anyone who needed to pace to take notes to do so. That's what a teacher named Mr. Starkey did for me at Green Mountain High School. We can do these small things which in reality are connected to a big thing and a big idea, and that's the environment must change, not the person. And last but not least, we can challenge the deficit model that surrounds young folks with atypical brains and bodies. You're told constantly as a kid like me, what's wrong with you? You know what you don't hear much about? You don't hear much about what is right with you. We need a capability model that maps the strengths, gifts, and talents and interests of every single student we encounter. I'm a writer today because of a teacher named Mr. R. Mr. R believed everybody had something right with them. He would ask every kid every day, hey, what are you good at? What are you good at? What are you good at? And he would ask me that question, and I would say nothing, because I was in IEP land. But that guy never gave up. And one day he came to me and he said, Jonathan, you are so good at telling stories. I think you could be a writer. I was 9 years old. Nobody had ever said that to me before in my life. I looked right at Mr. R And I said, Mr. R, are you out of your goddamn mind? I can't spell, man. And the guy looked back at me and said, Jonathan, in my class, screw spelling. I'm here today because of him. So those are three very concrete things that I think each and every one of us can do, not just for the young person that we care about, that matters, but it's what we can do collectively to challenge this tyrannical idea that there's a normal human being